Okay, stop scrolling. Just for a second. I want you to imagine something. Picture a Homo sapiens from 50,000 years ago. Not a caveman from a cartoon, not the grunting, hunched over creature Hollywood keeps putting in movies. A real one. Same brain as yours. Same lungs. Same hunger. Same capacity for frustration, joy, and really bad decisions. Same exact biological hardware running underneath that animal skin. Now imagine dropping him into a modern grocery store. He's standing in the cereal aisle. There are 47 types of cereal. One of them is literally called Honey Smacks. Another one has a cartoon tiger on the box telling him it's great. He doesn't know what a tiger on a box means. He grabs a cart. He doesn't know what a cart is. He figures it out quickly because he's smart. He's been outsmarting predators his whole life. He starts filling it. He passes the snack aisle. He passes the frozen food section. He passes the bakery, where something incredible is happening with bread and butter and sugar. He has never in his life experienced anything like this concentration of available food. His brain is going absolutely haywire. Here's the question, though. Not what happens to him emotionally, not how does he react to self-checkout, though that would be a great video. The real question is this: could that guy, that ancient elite survival machine optimized by millions of years of evolution, actually become obese? Could he? Because here's what we've been told our whole lives. Ancient humans were lean because they ran a lot. They hunted. They walked miles every day. They were basically prehistoric athletes with stone tools, and we are their disappointing descendants, sitting on couches, eating Honey Smacks directly out of the box at 11 p.m. But what if that story is incomplete? What if the real reason ancient humans weren't obese has almost nothing to do with how much they moved? What if the biology they passed down to us, the exact same biology running inside your body right now, is actually the reason obesity became possible in the first place? And what if, given the right conditions, an ancient human and a modern human would end up in exactly the same place? Let's go. First, we need to set the scene properly, because context matters here. We're not talking about Neanderthals, though they're fascinating. We're not talking about Homo erectus chipping rocks by a river 2 million years ago. We're talking about anatomically modern humans, Homo sapiens, people who, if you cleaned them up, gave them a haircut, and handed them a jacket, could absolutely walk into a coffee shop and blend in completely. These people lived between roughly 300,000 years ago and about 10,000 years ago before the agricultural revolution changed the entire structure of human civilization. They were hunter-gatherers. Their whole existence revolved around a single, brutal priority: find food, eat it, don't die, repeat. Simple in theory, absolutely brutal in practice. Their diet was varied, wildly, chaotically varied. Depending on where they lived, what season it was, and what the environment offered, they might eat mostly large game one week. Then tubers and roots, then fruit when it was in season, then fish, then eggs, then insects. Which, by the way, are genuinely packed with protein and not nearly as dramatic as people make them. There was no menu. There was no schedule. There was no concept of Tuesday is pasta night. There was just, what can I find today? And is it worth the energy it costs me to get it? That last part matters enormously, and we'll come back to it. The other critical element is this. Ancient humans did not eat 3 meals a day. They did not have a lunch break. They did not snack. They ate when food existed, and they did not eat when food didn't exist. Sometimes food didn't exist for days. Sometimes it didn't exist for weeks during harsh winters or droughts. There were no backup options. There was no secondary pantry. There was no delivery app with a 30-minute guarantee. That is not a lifestyle choice. That is just the reality of the world they lived in. Now, most people hear all of this and arrive at the obvious conclusion. Of course, ancient humans were thin. Of course, they were lean. They were running around all day, burning enormous amounts of energy and barely getting enough calories to function. Makes sense, right? Hold on. Here is where everything you think you know gets quietly dismantled. Scientists have actually studied the closest living equivalents we have to ancient humans, surviving hunter-gatherer populations that still live by the old methods. The most extensively studied among them is the Hadza people of northern Tanzania. The Hadza are extraordinary. They still hunt with handmade bows. They still forage. They cover enormous distances on foot every single day. Hadza women dig up tubers in the hard African soil and carry heavy loads over long distances. Hadza men track game across the open savanna for hours. They do not drive. They do not sit in chairs for 8 hours. They do not have desk jobs. They live the way our ancestors lived, and their level of daily physical activity would destroy the average modern person within about 4 business days. So when researchers strapped activity monitors to Hadza adults and actually measured their daily calorie burn with precision equipment, not self-reporting, not estimates, real measurements, everyone expected the obvious result. These people must be burning dramatically more calories than sedentary Westerners. They weren't. The study published in PLOS 1 found that total daily energy expenditure among the Hadza was statistically indistinguishable from adults in the United States, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, Japan. That actually sink in. A Hadza woman who walks miles across the savannah, digs in the earth, hauls water, and manages her children in the African heat burns roughly the same number of calories per day as an American woman who drives to her office and sits at a computer for 8 hours. Same, total, calories. How is that remotely possible? The answer is one of the most humbling things about the human body, and it has a name: metabolic adaptation. Here's what's happening under the hood. Yes, the Hadza move more, dramatically more, but the body is not a simple machine that outputs more energy the harder you push it. The body is more like an extremely cautious accountant. If you start spending more on one line item, physical activity, the accountant quietly finds cuts somewhere else to keep the total budget the same. The Hadza burn less energy at rest. Their basal metabolic rate, the energy your body uses just to keep you breathing and your heart beating and your cells functioning, is lower than the typical Westerners when you adjust for body size. The immune system gets slightly dialed back. Certain cellular maintenance processes run a little leaner. Hormonal activity shifts. The result is that the total daily calorie burn, when you add everything up, ends up nearly identical between a Hadza forager and an office worker in Chicago. This is not a flaw in human design. This is evolution doing exactly what evolution does, keeping you alive and functional in a world where caloric availability is uncertain and energy must be managed with extreme care. But here's what this tells us about ancient humans. If the most physically active population alive today burns the same calories as the most sedentary populations, then physical activity alone was never the primary reason ancient humans stayed lean. The real reason was far simpler. They couldn't get enough food, not because they weren't trying, because the world wouldn't give it to them consistently enough to produce a prolonged caloric surplus. And without a prolonged caloric surplus, the body cannot store enough fat to reach clinical obesity. Scarcity was doing all the heavy lifting. Now we have to talk about the most important piece of this entire puzzle, because this is where it gets genuinely fascinating and a little unsettling. The ancient human body was not passively neutral about fat storage, it was aggressively, enthusiastically pro-fat. The whole system was wired specifically to accumulate as much fat as possible the moment food became available, because the body knew, from deep evolutionary memory, that food would eventually stop being available. This is documented in what's called the thrifty gene hypothesis, first proposed by geneticist James Neal in 1962. The idea is that natural selection specifically favored individuals who were efficient at storing energy as fat during periods of abundance, because those individuals were more likely to survive the inevitable famines. The genes that make fat storage efficient weren't accidents. They were competitive advantages. The ancient human who could eat a surplus of berries and game during a good season and store it all as body fat was the one who made it through winter. Everyone else starved, so those efficient fat-storing genes propagated. They became the norm. Every human alive today carries those genes. You carry them. Your ancient ancestor carried them. The mechanism is identical. This means the ancient human was not lean because the ancient human didn't want to store fat. The body desperately wanted to store fat. It was constantly trying to. The ancient human was lean because the environment physically wouldn't allow the body to succeed. So here's the question that should be making you uncomfortable by now. Take that same body. That same thrifty, fat-hoarding, calorie-obsessed biology. Take those same genes. Now, place them in a world where calories are cheap, food is available 24 hours a day, and the only barrier between you and 3,000 calories is 5 minutes and a phone. What happens? You already know, because you're living it. There's direct historical evidence of exactly this collision playing out in real time, and it's one of the starkest natural experiments in medical history. The Pima people of Arizona are one of the most cited examples in obesity research. For thousands of years, they lived as farmers and foragers in the Sonoran Desert. They were lean. They were active. They had no obesity epidemic. They had adapted to a desert environment where calories were hard won and the body had to be efficient. Then, in the late 19th century, upstream settlers diverted the rivers the Pima relied on for irrigation. Their traditional farming systems collapsed. The U.S. government stepped in with food assistance programs. The food supplied was dominated by refined flour, lard, canned goods, and sugar. Within 1 or 2 generations, an evolutionary instant, the Pima had developed some of the highest rates of obesity and type 2 diabetes ever recorded in a human population. Rates that shocked researchers, rates that had no precedent in their history. Their genetics had not changed in the slightest. Their food environment had changed completely. And the proof that genetics weren't the problem? Their relatives. The Pima who lived across the border in the Sierra Madre Mountains of Mexico, the same ethnic group, the same ancient lineage, the same ancestral DNA, had continued eating a traditional diet. They remained significantly leaner and metabolically healthier than their Arizona counterparts. Same software, different inputs, completely different output. The thrifty gene is not a flaw. It's a feature that became a bug the moment the environment it was designed for ceased to exist. Now let's push the thought experiment further, because we've established that ancient humans had the fat storage biology. We've established that the environment was the constraint, not the body. But could an ancient human in their own world ever actually get fat, theoretically? Under very specific conditions, yes. Not all ancient environments were equally scarce. Coastal and riverine populations in particular had access to something unusual: concentrated, seasonal caloric abundance in the form of marine resources. Think about salmon runs in the Pacific Northwest. For a few weeks every year, rivers would fill with fish so dense you could practically reach in and grab them. The caloric density of salmon, high fat, high protein, is extraordinary. A population that camped by a river during a salmon run and ate aggressively could potentially consume enormous caloric surpluses for an extended period. If that happened to coincide with an unusually mild winter where stored fat wasn't metabolized as quickly as expected, it's at least biologically plausible that individuals in that population could carry more body fat than was strictly necessary for survival. But, and this is critical, they almost certainly couldn't reach clinical obesity as we define it today, because the food, even in abundance, lacked the specific combination of properties that drives modern overconsumption at scale. Natural food, even rich natural food, engages your satiety signals. The fat in a wild salmon triggers hormonal responses that tell your brain you've eaten enough. The protein in game meat is satiating. The fiber in tubers slows digestion. The variety of textures and flavors in a natural diet creates what researchers call sensory-specific satiety, the natural tendency to stop wanting a food once you've had enough of it. A salmon is filling. You can only eat so much salmon before your body waves the white flag. You cannot say the same about a bag of chips, because the chip was specifically engineered to not trigger satiety. The precise ratio of salt, fat, and carbohydrate in ultra-processed food is calibrated, not accidentally, not incidentally, but deliberately, to hit what food scientists call the bliss point, the combination that maximizes pleasure while minimizing the fullness signal. The combination that makes the next chip feel just as appealing as the first one, because your brain's reward circuitry never quite gets the satisfaction it was promised. The ancient world did not have this technology. Nature never produced a bliss point food, because nature had no incentive to prevent you from feeling full. Only an industry that profits from your continued consumption has that incentive. The archaeological record backs all of this up in ways that are almost uncomfortably clear. When physical anthropologists examine skeletal remains from Paleolithic hunter-gatherer populations, the picture that emerges is one of generally impressive metabolic health. Bone density is high. Joint wear patterns suggest a lifetime of varied functional movement rather than repetitive strain. Dental enamel, while worn by coarse foods, shows minimal evidence of cavities on pre-agricultural populations because the refined sugars that feed cavity-causing bacteria simply weren't part of the diet. There is no skeletal evidence of the kind of chronic metabolic disease we associate with obesity. No evidence of the bone changes associated with severe joint stress from excess body weight. No evidence of the arterial changes associated with decades of lipid accumulation. These were not sick people. Then agriculture happens. Around 10,000 years ago, humans begin settling, growing crops, storing grain, and the skeletal record shifts almost immediately, in ways that should shock us more than they do. Average height drops, in some populations by several inches within just a few generations after the agricultural transition. Bone density decreases. Cavities appear with suddenly high frequency. Signs of nutritional deficiency, particularly iron deficiency anemia, show up in the bone tissue. Evidence of chronic illness and infectious disease increases as populations crowd into settlements. Here's the irony. Agriculture gave us surplus. It gave us the ability to store food, to predict next year's calorie supply, to build cities and eventually civilization. But the immediate physiological cost was significant. A narrower diet, dominated by whatever grain was locally grown, meant less nutritional variety. And crucially, for the first time in human history, populations could live in a state of prolonged caloric surplus. For the first time, scarcity wasn't enforcing the reset. Agriculture didn't immediately cause obesity at scale. People were still working incredibly hard to farm the land. But it laid the groundwork. It removed the most fundamental biological constraint that had been keeping the thrifty gene in check for hundreds of thousands of years. The grocery store was invented the day the first granary was built. We just didn't notice the consequences for another 10,000 years. Let's address the physical fitness argument directly, because it's the most common objection. Even if the calorie math was similar, surely all that movement meant ancient humans had lower body fat and more muscle mass. Surely the physical demands of survival provided a kind of structural protection that kept obesity impossible regardless of calorie intake. Partly, yes, this part is real. Hunter-gatherers consistently show higher muscle mass and lower body fat percentages than modern sedentary populations, even when total calorie burn is comparable. The Hadza aren't just burning the same calories as Westerners. They're also significantly leaner and more muscular across all age groups. Older Hadza adults outperform much younger Western adults on cardiovascular fitness measures. The physical conditioning that comes from a lifetime of functional movement is genuine and significant, but this doesn't change the fundamental equation. The Hadza aren't lean because they move more and therefore burn more calories. They're lean because they eat an unprocessed, varied, naturally satiating diet with no bliss point foods, no ultra-processed snacks, and no engineered caloric density. If you gave the Hadza access to a Western diet while they maintained their traditional lifestyle, kept all the walking, all the foraging, all the physical activity, the research strongly suggests they would still gain weight. Because the calorie math would shift, not the burn side of the equation, the intake side. Movement helps, it genuinely does, and not just for weight management. The cardiovascular, metabolic, hormonal, and psychological benefits of regular physical activity are real and substantial. But movement alone, without addressing what goes into the system, is not the override switch that the wellness industry has spent decades pretending it is. So let's give this question a real answer. Could ancient humans become obese? In their own environment, almost certainly not. Not because the biology was different. Not because they had superior discipline or willpower or some ancestral virtue we've since lost. But because the environment physically prevented the sustained caloric surplus required for obesity to develop. Scarcity was the default setting. Famine was the periodic corrective. Natural, unprocessed, satiating food was the only food that existed. Their bodies desperately wanted to store fat. The world just wouldn't give them enough raw material to do it at scale. Drop that same ancient human into the modern food environment. Give them access to ultra-processed products engineered to defeat satiety, sedentary work, artificial light disrupting their sleep and cortisol rhythms, chronic psychological stress elevating their appetite hormones, and a delivery app that puts 10,000 calories within reach at any hour. They would be just as vulnerable as any modern person, possibly more, because they'd have no cultural framework for restraint, no lived experience of abundance, no understanding of what a serving size means or why it might matter. Their brain, encountering a drive-through menu for the first time, would register it as the greatest caloric windfall in the history of their species. Every ancient instinct would scream, eat everything, all of it, right now, store every calorie. Winter is always coming. Here's what all of this actually means. We are ancient humans, not metaphorically, literally. We carry the same genes, the same metabolic architecture, the same hormonal reward systems, the same thrifty biology. The gap between a Homo sapiens in 48,000 BCE and you reading this right now is, in evolutionary terms, essentially nothing. A few thousand generations. A blink. The body that evolved to survive scarcity is now navigating a world of engineered abundance, and it is struggling. Not because it's broken, but because it's doing exactly what it was built to do in an environment it was never built for. Every time you feel like you can't stop after a few chips, that's not a character flaw. That's a nervous system that evolved to maximize caloric intake, encountering food specifically designed to prevent satisfaction. Every time something sweet doesn't make you feel as full as a piece of actual fruit does, that's not weakness. That's your satiety hormones failing to register a food that was engineered to slip past them. Every time you're genuinely full, but the dessert menu still seems interesting, that's ancient reward circuitry responding to fat and sugar the way it was wired to respond for 300,000 years. Like a signal that this moment of abundance is precious and should not be wasted. The ancient human is not a symbol or a cautionary tale. The ancient human is the explanation. He didn't become obese because the world wouldn't let him. We gave him the world. And now we're living in the result.